Previously, we covered the history of this legendary game created by Hideo Kojima and Konami, from starting on the 3DO to using Lego to design each level, and even undergoing weapons training to get an understanding for the game's arsenal. However, the game had also went through a variety of cut content too, from an early high-res build, cut story elements, unused items, and a ton more leftover content hidden deep in the game's data. So today on this final part, we shall explore the history and beta unused content of Metal Gear Solid. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button and hit the like button too to further support us and keep creating new videos. While Metal Gear Solid was in development, the game, while definitely designated for the 3DO and the PlayStation, was initially being built on an engine on company PCs. As a result, without even taking in the limitations of those consoles, they had to build with high quality models and effects. We touched upon this within the last video, but today we'll look even further into it and compare. Looking at this, let's start with Snake, the model here looking to be built at a much higher poly count, accounting for everything from his shoulder pads to even the ends of his hair being defined, rather than being flat textures rendered on top of Snake, let alone the texture quality being a lot better overall. Right next to Snake, of course, are the guards. While wearing much of what is similar, the main difference here, they looked a lot more polished, together with the amount of detail to them, unlike the final game that has them looking pretty plain and basic, almost just a mishmash of green and black. Following this is Revolver Ocelot. Outside of cleaner textures, this one stayed a lot closer to what would become the final game's version. Of course, in this version, the sleeves actually were round. Then comes our third character, the Cyborg Ninja. Now surprisingly, this one has even less changes, but this was also one of the most detailed characters in the game too. His textures, of course, looking a lot cleaner then. But what's more interesting is how his sword actually glowed back then. As a result, when brought up to his mask, you can actually see the metallic reflection off it too, which compared to the final game, the mask there looked more plastic. In fact, the whole glow effect showcases a whole other lighting system they had in mind that would naturally reflect light, whether on Snake, Ocelot with his revolver showing the metallic sheen too, and of course the ninja here as well. Top that off with texture blurring being here too. But outside of characters, there were several other major differences too, the big one being the codec system. In this instance, it required Snake to physically find a place to hide first before making or answering a codec call. This would add a much higher challenge, especially in a boss fight, where that might have been next to impossible, thus why it might have been simplified. Let alone the UI looked completely different in this build, looking more detailed with the life bar being at the bottom, and the item menu having full colored images of the weapons to access. The radar also looking more vector based and with a unique shape. Also, alert mode seems to have been done differently. Caution simply seems to appear whenever an enemy is nearby, rather than recovering from an alert. I can see this getting super annoying if it had stayed. Top that off with the main area shown off being the early Basement 12 armory floor, with its many hallways. Based on the map, it clearly had a very different layout, including this large open area that wasn't in the final game. Along with that, we see the heliport too, with the Hindy hovering over. Strange that it says escape, but the Hindy does appear as a boss fight that you do try to run from later on, so this may be what it is alluding to. But after that, the game was eventually converted to a proper PlayStation specific engine, and thus everything had to be downscaled to what we know. However, a lot did still change as development progressed. Starting with this early heliport, what stands out the most is the existence of this forklift here. While it makes for neat decoration, it is clearly not on a flat surface, but what's more interesting is that it moves. Was there a guard moving it? If so, that would have been an extra challenge to avoid, which would likely make people want to avoid the left side more so than they did in the final game. Along with that, a second truck was also present here too. What's interesting is that the camera appears to be controllable actually in this build. It's possible that they were originally making this with the DualShock in mind, but since it wasn't something too common at the time, maybe why they dropped the controllable camera and settled for fixed angles instead. The tank hangar is next. It appears that it may have went through 2 builds at least. The first is a rather smaller one, about half the size of what we got. The metal bridge is still there, but none of the doors on the left. Downstairs is a den of guards, and without that iconic tank thanks to its smaller size. The guards here look a lot like the ones from the early build, featuring the helmets and even a little bit more texture at that. The following build, however, brought it closer to what we know. The first change is the lack of the corner camera seen in the final game. Instead, what we have here is a guard patrolling, eventually swapped in with a camera that lacked a cone. Guess that was just exclusive to guards back then? As well, the elevator seems to be using a metal grating as opposed to the 2 solid steel doors. Kinda misplaced for a place with such intense security. Going further, we get to Meryl's jail cell, which based on how Snake is viewing her doing sit-ups from below would imply that originally Snake could sneak into a room from the ground as opposed to never. The most you see of that is via the ventilation in the final game. And going even further with Meryl, it seems she actually was going to accompany you in fighting Psycho Mantis rather than be knocked out / mind controlled for it. The fight with the cyborg ninja is in a different location originally, or rather starts differently, seemingly starting in the corridor that leads up to Otachan's lab. Yes, the very hallway he killed all those guards. Clearly, Snake was going to go ham upon seeing that slaughter. A few other smaller differences include the crane missing from the blast furnace, and the radar being active in the underground passage to the communication tower. Speaking of which, Meryl is also seen here fighting along with Snake. Seems they really were planning to have Meryl a lot more involved instead of just being shot here and not doing anything afterwards. Now we also have several cut items here too. Wolf's, Hudadrig, or however that's supposed to be pronounced, MGGK2, and Steps. These either may be cut items or maybe just early names for final items. Hard to say, but for early names of final items, the scope was called the Finder, night goggles as RNPAS7, and cigs were called the Mausoleum, which is actually the brand name of the cigarettes that Snake uses. Other details are the UI, while very similar to the final games, had some differences, such as the life bar still being at the bottom, and alert mode was a lot simpler, with it just flashing red over the map with a small countdown. In relation, we can see Snake fight in these early modes, and instead of a simple low kick, would do a signature roundhouse kick, as well as seeing Snake pulling off pins off his grenades with his teeth, like a showy badass. Something Snake normally isn't. Along with that, there is the infamous C4 scene from the trailer, which shows Snake set up a ludicrous amount of C4 and activate them. In the final game, that is an impossible feat, as there is a limit to how much you can put up. Nearing the game's release, a demo disc called the Pilot Disc was released. When data mined, it reveals a lot of cut material, including several unused animations, most famously crouch walking, a feature that would become a mainstay in the series later. For now, it might have been deemed to make the game too easy. The very roundhouse kick combo is on this disc too, but above that, it seems the opening cutscene had an entirely different camera angle to go with. Clearly, Kojima wanted to make the opening stand out with this much tinkering. As well, they weren't even going to give the guards actual collision. Normally, you'd run right through them, but it seems they originally would let Snake actually push them physically. Granted, they slid and not actually tumbled back, so it was unfinished. Now, beyond the prototypes, the final game still carried several unused pieces with it, which, continuing from the previous pieces on audio, the codec calls themselves, which were plentiful and existed in many capacities, including even mocking someone for having a mono TV.
Snake, you're not using a stereo TV?
It can't be. A mono TV.
Have a few unused codec calls too. One of these is for right after the Metal Gear fight, and before fighting the final boss Liquid Snake, where Snake can talk to the Colonel about how he can't move.
Snake, great job! You stopped Metal Gear!
No, it's not time to celebrate yet. I can't move.
Snake, can you turn your neck? Take a look around.
This as such is left unused, since it goes directly to Liquid's monologue. Simultaneously, Mei Ling also had a unique codec call for the same section after the Metal Gear fight and before Liquid Snake in order to save the game.
Mei Ling, I don't think I can go through all that again. Please save the mission.
Okay, Snake, I'll take care of it.
Amazingly, both were actually voiced, showing that it might have been a late development removal, but there were also 2 codec calls with Master Miller and Nastasha, which were to activate if you try to go north without defeating Psycho Mantis. Normally, there is no way north without crossing Psycho Mantis' room, so maybe he originally wasn't going to be in his room, and they would tell you if you enter that room, which would mean that something would need to trigger that fight if so. In addition, there was a single piece of soundtrack that went unused, this being an instrumental version of the game's ending theme, The Best Is Yet to Come. This was supposed to play when Meryl was shot by Sniper Wolf.
持久戦よ。彼女は何時間でも何日でも何週間でもじっと待ち続けるわ。あなたを観察し動くのを待ってる。
メリルの体力が持つかどうか。
It was changed to a more general track from the game. It's possible that this theme was originally going to be used for more serious or sadder situations before the theme Enclosure took its place, which was famously used for Sniper Wolf's death. That bringing us to the game's several unused textures, as the battle with Sniper Wolf has an actual textured face made for when Snake shoots her dead. This might have been a bit too gruesome for the game, which may be why they had her face covered with a sheet in the end. Along with that, there was a texture for an unused item box for the nuclear warhead storage building. Not exactly known what it belongs to, but it has been theorized that it might have been for the 4th scrapped cardboard box that one can take to the canyon, which even has unused dialogue referencing it.
To the canyon, huh?
Speaking of which, the nuclear warhead storage also has 2 early unused textures for doors. Possibly these existed as early as the big 1997 trailer, in which several textures remain in the data, including the original texture for the Cyborg Ninja's mask that was more detailed, and the original textures for the Snow Genome soldiers. One of the more interesting bits, however, is how in much of Snake's art, he had a tail to his bandana. Yet in-game, that is nowhere to be seen, and looks more like a headband. But seems they were actually planning to have that in-game as a single texture. My guess would be that due to the PlayStation's limitations, making it flow might have been a bit difficult. Keeping it static wouldn't look right either, or simply turning it. And considering this is a titular Hideo Kojima game, I can't believe he would be that particular about how it would flow. While much of the content had been cut due to refinement, director Hideo Kojima did also have several features he couldn't get in for various reasons. So much so that he only got 60% of his ideas in. One related to the many rats that were crawling around Shadow Moses, specifically the ones in the vents, which Kojima had plans for Snake to take on as pets. What would they do gameplay wise? Hard to say, but maybe they could have been planned to distract the guards? But ultimately, his justification would be that Snake would find a fondness in them as the first life form he encounters in Shadow Moses' cold Alaskan winter. And to go further with the idea of rats, during the first Sniper Wolf battle, he was planning to even let the player shoot the rats constantly, with bigger and bigger rats coming in to take their place. But this was eventually removed, as Kojima felt the joke played out for too long. Another was his Kodak support, called Mariachi, a Spanish singing battle advisor who would sing to Snake every time. Removed since Kojima found it ridiculous, as you'd have to listen to his whole song before getting the battle tip. Further, when Snake is locked up with Johnny the Guard on duty, there were plans to make further use of Snake's cigarettes, which only were used for getting past lasers in the final game. Here, he would befriend the guard by giving him a pack, possibly a way to trick him to get out, which this would become an idea that Kojima would return to. But finally, a large one was an idea relating to the final turret gun battle with Liquid Snake, where originally one would be able to choose to drive or control the gun. While it would make sense with Meryl, since she knows how to use a gun, with Otacon however, he probably only would be able to drive and not much use shooting, so thus it was cut. Aside from the creative choices, the cut content of Metal Gear Solid came as a result of Hideo Kojima wanting to build a more fleshed out world, but hampered by technical limitations. His idea was to make a realistic and believable world with every detail in the surroundings having to matter, but he wouldn't have to wait long for that. Going back, Kojima was nowhere near as done with the series yet, as evident with the post-credits scene of the game, and as such started planning a sequel right away, with design documents ready as soon as January 1999 for Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty for the upcoming PlayStation 2. That would be more than capable to make the world that Kojima wants, with every detail accounted for, as well as looking and feeling like a film. A game that could be said to have built even greater hype, and a game with an even larger controversy around it. A game that I plan to cover soon, so hit the subscribe button for I plan to be back with more Metal Gear and other gaming history soon. Hit the like button and comment below on what was your favorite moment in the original Metal Gear Solid. So everyone, thank you for watching!